and think about your earliest race-related memory. How old are you? 3, 5, 7, 10, 13? The answer is probably going to depend on where you grew up. But now think about what emotion is attached to that memory. Maybe it's curiosity or affection. But most people I talk to will say that they have an early memory attached to grade school, kindergarten, early elementary, and the emotion that's there for them is something like confusion, anxiety, fear, embarrassment, sadness, shame. Now, if you've got an early memory and you've got some emotion attached to it, think about whether you talked about that experience when it occurred with an adult, with a parent or a teacher, some other caring adult. I asked this question recently of a group of Stanford freshmen, and most of them said they did not. And in fact, that's true with most of the audiences I speak to. Most people can remember an early memory with a strong emotion attached to it, but yet they didn't talk to anyone about it, which is puzzling because most 5, 6, 7-year-olds are pretty candid, and they don't filter themselves much. So we have to wonder, why not? Why did so many people have an early experience and not share it with an adult in their lives? Had they already been shhed about it? Had they already learned you're not supposed to talk about race? My first experience with a preschool conversation was with a 3-year-old, my own son, named Jonathan. When Jonathan was 3, we lived in Massachusetts, and he attended a daycare center where he was the only black child in his class. One day I picked him up and he said, "Mom, Eddie says my skin is brown because I drink chocolate milk. Is that true?" I said, "No, Jonathan, that's not true. Your skin is brown because you have something in your skin called melanin. Everybody has some. Even Eddie. Remember when he went to visit his grandmother in Florida and he came back with a tan? It was the melanin that made his skin turn brown in the sun. Everybody has some, but at your school, in your class, you are the kid with the most." Jonathan seemed to understand what I was saying, and he was very tickled by the idea that he had the most of something. But I wondered about Eddie, the kid with the chocolate milk theory. Had anybody set him straight? I went to school the next day and I asked the teacher how they were addressing questions of physical difference in the classroom. We know that preschoolers notice difference. Skin color is the one they most comment on, but they notice differences in hair texture, the shape of one's eyes, other kinds of physical differences. But the teacher said very pleasantly to me, "You know, it hasn't come up." Now, I knew that it had come up with Jonathan. He'd obviously told me about that. But then I thought, well, maybe she hadn't heard those conversations. Maybe those conversations had taken place on the sandbox, at the lunch table, out on the playground, out of earshot of the teacher. I also wondered if maybe she'd heard those conversations in passing and, not knowing exactly what to say, had engaged in what we might call selective inattention. You know, those things that come up, you let them pass, you don't comment on them, you forget about them, you're just not really tuned in. It's not just teachers who struggle with this. I know parents who do too. Imagine this scene. Imagine a white mom with her child in a grocery store. The little girl is 3 years old. They live in a mostly white community, and they're shopping together, and the little girl notices a dark-skinned person, perhaps for the first time. And she says in that loud 3-year-old voice, "Mommy, why is that person so dirty?" Mom is likely to do what? Shh, absolutely. The mom is likely to feel embarrassed because of the child's statement. But in fact, preschool children, particularly white children, often associate darker skin with dirt because they know that if their skin got darker, it might be from playing in the dirt. That's a common misconception. Imagine instead of saying shh, that mom had said something like, "Honey, her skin is as clean as yours." People come in different colors, just like we have different hair color. People have different skin colors. It doesn't have to be a complicated conversation. She might have gone on and explained about melanin the way I did with my son Jonathan. But the fact is, often we don't know what to say, and we stop with shh. And as a consequence, children do not become what many parents say they are, colorblind. Instead, they become color silent. They learn early on that they're not supposed to talk about it. Now, some conversations are harder than others. I want you to go back to that grocery store. This time it was me and my son Jonathan, who was a little older in this story. He's 4 years old. We're shopping together. He's riding on the top of the basket. And he says to me, "Mom, Tommy said I was black. Am I black?" I said, "Yes, Jonathan, you are." He looked at me quizzically and he said, "But my skin is brown." I realized then, of course, that young children don't understand the symbolic language that we as adults use. And I said, "Jonathan, you're right. It is a little confusing." I said, "But black is a term that people use to describe African Americans, just like they use the term white to describe European Americans." I said, "African Americans aren't really black. They come in all shades of brown. Light brown like me, dark brown like your dad, medium brown like you. In the same way, white people aren't really white. They're kind of pink or beige or sometimes light brown." He looked at me very seriously, said, "Yes, they are, Mom." I said, "Jonathan," I had a grocery list written on a white piece of paper. I held it up. I said, "Jonathan, they don't look like this." He said, "Yes, they do." I said, "No, they don't." And then I realized that preschoolers, of course, learn from concrete experiences. And so I said, "Jonathan, let's go find one and see." So we are in the grocery store, the aisle by ourselves, but sure enough, we turn the corner and there's a white woman shopping. And I leaned over, I whispered in his ear, I said, "She doesn't look like this piece of paper." He agreed, she did not. I thought maybe we could move on in the conversation. But I also was conscious of the fact that as his mom, I was concerned about the tone of his voice when he asked me that question, "Am I black?" Almost as though perhaps he was starting to get negative messages about whether it was okay to be black. Maybe there was something wrong with being black, and I wanted to address that. So I talked to him about the fact that, one, he could tell Tommy that he was African American. And I started to talk about the pride he should have in being African American. And I was getting ready to wax eloquently about the joys of the ancient civilizations of Africa when he interrupted me and said, "Mom, if Africa is so great, what are we doing here?" I had a very precocious 4-year-old. And I knew that I had to answer his question, but I didn't know how I could answer it without talking about slavery. And how do you talk to a 4-year-old about a history of cruelty and injustice? I knew there were 3 things that I had to keep in mind if I was going to tell that story. One of those things was that I need to reassure him, because 4-year-olds are easily frightened, I needed to reassure him that these were things that were in the past and that they weren't things that he had to worry about. 2, I wanted to tell a story that featured resistance to victimization. I wanted to talk about the enslaved Africans as not passive victims, but people who had resisted their victimization. And 3, I wanted to talk about the fact that it's possible to have white allies. Not all white people supported slavery. There were white people who worked against it. And that just as the Africans had resisted being victims, there were white people who had resisted being victimizers. And so I began my story. At the beginning, I reminded him of his preschool and the fact that they had talked about the colonial era and celebrated Thanksgiving, talked about that time. And I said, you know, a long time ago, before there were grocery stores and roads and houses and all the things we see here now, when the Europeans came, they wanted to build those things. They wanted to build roads and farms and grocery stores and houses and grow cotton and other crops, and they needed a lot of good, strong, smart workers. And so they went to Africa to get the strongest, smartest workers they could find. But I said, unfortunately, they didn't want to pay them. And so they kidnapped them and they brought them here and they made them work on the farms and do the building and all of that work without paying them. And that was really unfair. And they wouldn't let them leave when they wanted to go home. And that was really unfair too. And I said, many of them worked very hard to escape. And some of them were able to, though not everybody could. And they found people who were willing to help them. There were white people who didn't think slavery was right and who joined with them to work against slavery. And eventually, working together, they were able to abolish it, to end it. He was listening very carefully to me as I spoke about this. I emphasized the fact that, Jonathan, you were never a slave, I was never a slave, Daddy was never a slave, Grandmommy and Granddaddy were never slaves. This was really a long, long time ago. And now slavery is illegal. He was paying very close attention, and then he said, well, when they weren't slaves anymore, why didn't they go back to Africa? Fortunately, I knew enough to say some did. But I said, you know, some people might have wanted to stay because by that time they had family members here, they had friends here. And then he interrupted me again and said, and this is a nice place too. And I said, yes, it is. I'm sure you can imagine my relief that the conversation was over. But retrospectively, I was glad that it was me, actually, that had the opportunity to introduce this painful history, because I got to put my spin on it in the way that reassured him and that also emphasized resistance to victimization as well as resistance to being a victimizer. I know that these are hard conversations. I've had the privilege of working with teachers across the country, and many of them have told me how hard it is for them to talk to elementary school children, even older children, about this painful history. And I've talked to African American children in particular who have said how painful it is for them sometimes to sit in classrooms when this history comes up, because it is so often told from the point of passive victimization, without the story of resistance, without the story of rebellion as part of the narrative. The reality is we have a painful history, and sometimes we have a painful present. In this moment, our silence will not help us. We have to have conversations. The way forward to changing our future is with a conversation, sometimes even a conversation with a 3-year-old. Thank you very much.